The year was 1888, and the grief in Arthur Vance's house had weight. It settled on the furniture like a fine layer of dust, dulled the shine on the window panes, and clung to the very air he breathed. Out on the high plains of Montana, where the sky was a vast and often indifferent canvas, his isolation was absolute. The ranch, once a sprawling testament to a shared dream, was now just a monument to his loss. Each fence post he had driven into the hard soil with his own hands, each board on the side of the barn, felt like a headstone marking the grave of the life he had lived with Martha. She had been gone for 2 years, taken by a winter fever that had swept through with the ferocity of a blizzard, leaving behind a silence that screamed. Arthur, a man once defined by his quiet capability and the gentle strength in his hands, was now a hollowed-out version of himself. He moved through the days on muscle memory alone, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. The cattle, once his pride, had dwindled. The fields, which should have been turned and ready for the sparse spring planting, lay fallow and choked with last year's dead grass. The land itself seemed to be grieving with him, or perhaps it was simply reflecting the neglect of a man who had lost his reason to strive. Mr. Hale, the banker from the town of Prospect Creek, had made the trip out the week before. His buggy had been a black speck against the immense landscape, growing larger until it deposited the man himself, stiff and formal, onto Arthur's porch. Hale's words were polite, but carried the sharp edge of finality. The loans taken out to build this life were now an anchor, pulling the ranch under. Arthur had 90 days. 90 days to turn back the tide of decay, to show profit, to prove the Vance ranch was still a viable enterprise. It was an impossible task. It would have been difficult with 2 pairs of capable hands and a full heart. For a man alone, drowning in sorrow, it was a death sentence for his legacy. Arthur had simply nodded, his gaze fixed on a distant butte that Martha had loved to sketch. He felt no fight in him, only a profound weariness. Let it go, a voice whispered inside him. Let it all crumble and be swept away by the wind, just as she had been. He was living in a state of quiet resignation, waiting for the end. The house was too big, the silence too loud, and the memories too sharp. Each night, he sat at the long kitchen table Martha had insisted on, big enough for the family they had planned to have, and ate his meager meal alone, the scrape of his fork on the plate, the only sound in the universe. It was on one such night, with a wind howling outside like a thing grieving its own losses, that a new sound broke the monotony. It was a frantic, desperate knocking on his front door, a sound so alien in his solitude that he first thought he had imagined it, but it came again, sharper this time, insistent. He rose slowly, his body stiff. He took the rifle from its pegs by the door, not out of any real fear, but from a habit ingrained by years on the frontier. He did not care much what happened to him, but a man's home was his home. He pulled the heavy door inward, and the wind tore at him, bringing with it a swirl of dust and the scent of rain on the dry air. On his porch, huddled together against the gale, stood a group of figures. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the lantern light they carried, and another moment to comprehend what he was seeing. It was a woman, no, a girl barely out of her teens, holding the lantern high. Her face was pale and strained, her dark hair whipped across her cheeks by the wind. Behind her, 6 other figures, all female, all younger, clung to one another like a flock of frightened birds. The youngest looked to be no more than a child. The eldest one stepped forward, her chin lifted with a courage that seemed to defy her exhaustion. "Sir," she began, her voice clear but trembling slightly. "Our wagon, the axle broke about a mile down the road. We saw your light. We mean no trouble. We just need shelter from the storm. We can pay." She gestured to a small, worn satchel. Arthur's gaze swept over them. They were soaked through, their clothes thin and patched. Fear was a palpable scent on them, sharper than the rain. His first instinct, born of his self-imposed exile, was to refuse. He wanted no part of the world's troubles. His own were enough to crush him. He wanted to close the door and return to the familiar comfort of his misery. But then his eyes fell on the smallest girl, who was shivering violently, her face buried in an older sister's skirt. He saw not a stranger, but the ghost of a child he and Martha had never had. He saw a vulnerability that pierced the thick calluses around his heart. The rifle in his hand suddenly felt heavy and foolish. He lowered it, leaning it against the doorframe. He did not speak, could not find the words. He simply stepped back, holding the door open wider. It was not a welcome, not yet. It was a concession, a momentary crack in the fortress of his grief. For one night, the screaming silence of his home would be filled with the sound of strangers breathing, and he did not yet know if that was a blessing or a curse. He led them not into the main house, but to the barn. It was the most logical place, dry and filled with hay for warmth. He felt their collective gaze on his back, a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. The eldest, who introduced herself as Abigail Donovan, watched him with an unnerving intensity, her eyes assessing every move he made. He understood. A lone man, a remote ranch, 7 vulnerable females. Their caution was a shield they had clearly learned to carry. "The loft is clean," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "There are blankets. It will be warm enough." "Thank you, mister," Abigail said, her formality a brittle wall between them. "We are in your debt." Her sisters remained clustered behind her, their eyes wide and dark in the lantern light. He saw their faces properly now. Eleanor with a steady, quiet composure. Cora and Rose, twins with identical braids and matching expressions of apprehension. Beatrice, whose hands never stopped twisting the fabric of her dress, and Hannah, who held the youngest, Clara, in a protective embrace. They were a set of matched plates, each showing a different crack, but all clearly from the same kiln. Arthur fetched a stack of worn wool blankets from a storage chest, the scent of cedar and Martha's dried lavender rising from them. The smell was a punch to the gut. He placed them on a hay bale without a word and turned to leave. "We will work to repay your kindness." Abigail's voice stopped him at the door. "We do not take charity." He glanced back at her. Her spine was ramrod straight. Pride, he thought, and fear. They were intertwined in her like threads in a rope. "The storm is payment enough for a roof," he managed, and then he was gone, shutting the heavy barn door behind him, leaving them to their own whispered conversations and the scent of hay and animals. Back in the house, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty, but expectant. He could feel their presence across the yard, a disturbance in the stagnant pool of his existence. He sat at his kitchen table and stared into the cold hearth. The image of the 7 sisters burned into his mind. He had offered a night's shelter. Come morning, he would give them what food he could spare, help them fix their axle if possible, and send them on their way. His life was already over. He had no room for the beginning of someone else's story. The next morning dawned cold and grey, the storm having passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Arthur rose at his usual hour before dawn and went about his chores, the movements automatic. He milked his one remaining cow, fed the chickens, and checked on his horse. As he approached the barn, he saw that the large doors were already open. Inside, the sisters were awake and had already imposed a surprising order on the space. The blankets were neatly folded, the hay swept into tidy piles. They were sharing a small loaf of hard bread from their own meager supplies. When he entered, they fell silent, their movements freezing. Abigail stepped forward once more, her expression resolute. "Mister," she said, not waiting for him to speak. "My sisters and I, we are in need of more than a night's shelter. We are looking for a place to stay, a place to work." Arthur almost laughed. It would have been a bitter, rusty sound. "This is a ranch, miss, not a boarding house, and I have no money for hired hands." "We are not asking for wages," she pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "We are asking for sanctuary. We have eyes. We see the state of this place. The fields are fallow, the fences are down. You need help. You need hands. And you think you can provide them? The skepticism in his voice was thick as mud. He looked at Beatrice's delicate wrists, at Clara's tiny form. This is not woman's work. This is breaking labor from sunup to sundown. Have you ever been so desperate that you would do anything to survive? She asked, her voice low and fierce. Have you ever been hunted? We are strong. We are quick learners. And there are 7 of us. What one of us cannot do, 7 of us can. We will be your hands, Mr. Vance, in exchange for a roof over our heads and protection from the man we are fleeing. The unspoken plea hung in the air. Protection. It was a word he had not associated with himself for a very long time. He had failed to protect Martha from the fever. He was failing to protect their legacy from the bank. What could he possibly offer these strangers? And yet, he looked around at his crumbling ranch. He thought of Mr. Hale's 90-day deadline. He was a drowning man, and these girls were offering him a strange, unlikely lifeline. It was madness. It was doomed to fail. But his own plan to do nothing and let it all sink was also a failure. This, at least, was a different kind of failure. You are fleeing your father, he stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. A shadow passed over Abigail's face, and behind her, the other sisters flinched as if struck. He is a cruel man, she said simply. The understatement held a world of pain. We will not go back. We will die first. Arthur looked from her determined face to the hopeful, terrified eyes of her sisters. He thought of the empty house, the silent meals, the slow, grinding death of everything he had ever built. He was already at the bottom. There was nowhere to fall. The house is yours, he heard himself say, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. The work starts at dawn. If you cannot keep up, you leave. That's the deal. A collective sigh of relief, fragile as a bird's wing, went through the sisters. Abigail's shoulders, which had been held so rigidly, slumped for a fraction of a second. She gave a single sharp nod. Thank you, she whispered. We will not fail you. Arthur turned and walked away before he could take it back, the weight of his own impulsive decision settling upon him. He had just invited 7 strangers, 7 problems, into the heart of his grief. He did not know it then, but he had also just invited in the first glimmer of hope he had seen in 2 years. The first weeks were a trial of patience and sheer will. Arthur, accustomed to the silent competence of working alone or with Martha, found himself thrust into the role of a reluctant teacher. His instructions were gruff, clipped, and devoid of encouragement. He expected them to fail. He expected them to give up, to be broken by the sheer physicality of the labor. They did not. He showed them how to mend fences, his large, calloused hands guiding the wire, and their smaller, quicker fingers learned to twist and secure it with a surprising dexterity. He taught them how to clear rocks from the south pasture, a brutal, soul-crushing task. They worked in a line, their movements uncoordinated at first, but they worked without complaint. At the end of the day, their hands were raw and bleeding, their backs aching, but they returned the next morning. Cora and Rose, the twins, discovered an aptitude for working with the chickens and tending the vegetable garden Martha had planted, which had since gone wild. Under their care, it began to show signs of life again, green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Eleanor, quiet and observant, proved to have a calming effect on the livestock. She learned to milk the cow with a gentle patience Arthur had not felt in years. Beatrice and Hannah, though younger, helped with hauling water, weeding, and the 1,000 other small tasks that kept a homestead running. Even little Clara found jobs, collecting eggs and keeping a watchful eye for snakes. Abigail worked alongside Arthur, tackling the hardest jobs. She refused to be relegated to lighter duties, her determination a silent challenge to his skepticism. She learned to swing an axe, her blows clumsy at first, then rhythmic and effective. She learned to read the sky for weather, her gaze sweeping the horizon with the same intensity she had first shown on his porch. Slowly, imperceptibly, the ranch began to change. The fences stood straighter, the fields were cleared. The sounds of the place shifted from the mournful sigh of the wind to the chatter of the sisters, the clang of a hammer, the distant melody of a song one of them hummed while they worked. The house, his house, was the most transformed. It was no longer a tomb. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale air of sorrow. The long, silent kitchen table was now filled every evening, the room buzzing with the quiet energy of their shared exhaustion and survival. Arthur remained distant, eating with them, but rarely speaking, a ghost at his own feast. He observed them, this strange flock he had taken under his wing. He saw the way they cared for one another, the fierce protectiveness in Abigail's eyes, the gentle way Eleanor would soothe Clara's scraped knee, the shared smiles between the twins. They were a unit, a fortress of 7, and he was the stone wall they sheltered behind. One afternoon, he found Cora in the overgrown remains of Martha's flower garden. She was on her knees, carefully pulling weeds from around a stubborn, thorny rosebush that had somehow survived the neglect. It had been Martha's favorite. Cora looked up, startled, dirt smudging her cheek. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I saw it was choking. I thought it deserved a chance to breathe." Arthur said nothing. He simply looked at the bush, at the girl's earnest, dirt-stained hands. He remembered Martha on her knees in that same spot, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, humming to herself. The memory didn't hurt with its usual searing intensity. It was a dull ache, softened by the sight of this girl's unexpected care. He gave a curt nod and walked away, but something inside him had shifted. They weren't just working the land, they were tending to its soul, and in doing so, they were unknowingly tending to his. A few nights later, a late frost threatened the newly sprouted vegetables. Arthur was up half the night, helping the sisters cover the tender plants with burlap sacks and anything else they could find. They worked side by side in the frigid darkness, their breath pluming in the lantern light, a silent, frantic team. In that shared, urgent effort, a new kind of understanding was forged, one that needed no words. He was no longer just their protector. They were protecting the ranch, his ranch, together. As the weeks turned into a month, then 2, Arthur found himself speaking more. He would point out a hawk circling high above, telling them its name. He would share a story about a particularly harsh winter from years past. He spoke of Martha once, a brief, halting sentence about how she had been the one to choose the spot for the house, because of the way the sun set behind the buttes. He said it to Abigail as they repaired a section of the barn roof, and she had just listened, her silence a vessel of respect. In turn, he learned more about them, not from direct stories, which they never offered, but from fragments of conversation. From the fears that flickered in their eyes when a stranger rode past on the main road. He learned that their father, Patrick Donovan, was a man whose rage was fueled by whiskey and whose fists made no distinction between his daughters. They had lived a life of quiet terror, their mother having passed years before, leaving them to his whims. Their escape was not an act of teenage rebellion, it was a desperate bid for their lives. This knowledge settled heavily in Arthur. The abstract idea of a cruel father became a visceral reality. He started watching the road more carefully himself, the rifle by the door, no longer just a habit. The 90-day deadline from the bank still loomed, a shadow on the horizon, but now there was a second, more menacing shadow, and it had a name. He had taken on more than a workforce. He had taken on their fight. The realization did not frighten him. Instead, for the first time in 2 years, it made him feel something akin to purpose. The fragile peace of their new life was shattered on a sweltering afternoon in late summer. Arthur and Abigail were hauling water from the creek when they saw the dust cloud on the road, moving too fast for a farmer's wagon, too purposeful for a casual traveler. Arthur's hand went still on the bucket handle. A cold dread, familiar yet different from the coldness of grief, crept into his veins. "Go to the house," he said, his voice low and even. "Get your sisters inside. All of them now." Abigail's face had gone pale, but her eyes were flinty. She didn't argue. She dropped her bucket and ran, her skirts flying behind her. Arthur watched her go before turning his gaze back to the road. He walked steadily back toward the house, his stride measured, and retrieved the rifle. He didn't load it. Not yet. He just stood on the porch, the smooth wood of the stock, a solid presence in his hands, and waited. The buggy that pulled up was not the one he expected. It was Sheriff McBride, and next to him, looking even more severe than usual, was Mr. Hale from the bank. The sheriff was a reasonable man, but he was also a man who disliked complications. Mr. Hale was a man who only saw profit and loss. Arthur knew this visit was not a social call. "Arthur," Sheriff McBride said, climbing down from the buggy. His eyes flickered past Arthur to the house, where the faces of the younger Donovan sisters had briefly appeared in the window before vanishing. "There are rumors in town, ugly ones." Mr. Hale remained seated, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Vance," he said, his voice sharp, "the deadline on your note is approaching. I came out here to see what progress you've made. Instead, I hear tales that you're harboring a runaway brood of girls. It's unseemly. People are talking. It does not inspire confidence in your character or your ability to manage your affairs." "What I do on my own land is my affair," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not when the bank owns most of it," Hale countered. "And not when the girl's own father has been in town, telling anyone who will listen how you've lured away his daughters." The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. Patrick Donovan. He was here. He was close. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It was poisoning the wells in town, turning the community against them. "Patrick Donovan is a drunk and a brute," Arthur said, his knuckles white on the rifle. "And his daughters are not prisoners here. They are my hired hands." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Hired hands, Arthur. They look like children. Donovan claims you're taking advantage of them. He wants them back." "He'll get them back over my dead body," Arthur stated. The words came out with a force that surprised even himself. The hollow man was gone, replaced by someone fierce, someone protective. Mr. Hale scoffed. "This is precisely what I mean. This, melodrama. It's not the behavior of a sound businessman. It's the behavior of a man who has lost his grip. Consider this your final warning, Vance. Settle your accounts or get your affairs in order. This situation with these girls has only solidified the bank's position." They left in a cloud of dust and judgment, leaving Arthur standing on the porch, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He was being squeezed from both sides. The bank would take his land. Donovan would take his family, because that's what they had become. He looked at the house, at the closed door behind which 7 people were holding their breath, and he knew he could not let either happen. The resignation he had felt for 2 years had burned away, cauterized by a righteous anger. He had something to lose again. He had everything to lose. That night, the mood at the dinner table was somber. The sisters knew. They had heard the men's raised voices. Fear was a ghost sitting beside each of them. After the meal, as the younger girls cleared the plates, Abigail and Eleanor stayed behind with Arthur. "He's here," Abigail said. It wasn't a question. Arthur nodded. "He's in town, spreading poison." Eleanor's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap they were bloodless. "He will come for us." "We should leave," Abigail said, the words costing her. "We have brought this trouble on you, Mr. Vance. We can't let you lose your home because of us. We are grateful for everything, but we must go." "No," Arthur said, his voice resonating with a certainty that startled them. "This is your home now. Running is not a solution, it's just a delay. The fight is here." He looked at them, at their brave, frightened faces. "Your father underestimates you. The bank underestimates me. Let them. We will work. We will meet the deadline. And if Donovan comes here, he will find more than a broken-down widower waiting for him." He saw a flicker of hope in their eyes, a reflection of the fire he felt in his own gut. He was no longer just protecting them. They were in this together. The ranch was not just his legacy anymore. It was their sanctuary, and they would defend it. From that moment on, they worked with a renewed, almost frantic energy. They rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set. They were a single unit, driven by a shared purpose, to save their home. They were no longer just surviving, they were fighting back. The final 10 days before the bank's deadline felt like a lifetime. Every waking moment was consumed by work. They harvested the small crop of hay, baling it by hand. They repaired the last of the fences, ensuring the cattle bolstered by a few new heads Arthur had managed to purchase on credit from a sympathetic neighboring rancher who had seen their efforts were secure. The vegetable garden yielded a bounty that surprised them all, and Eleanor and Cora worked tirelessly to can and preserve it, filling the pantry shelves. The ranch was alive, humming with industry. It looked better than it had in years, better even than before Martha had passed. It was a testament to what 7 determined sisters and 1 reawakened man could accomplish. But the threat of Patrick Donovan was a constant, oppressive presence. Every rider on the road, every unfamiliar sound in the night, sent a jolt of fear through the house. Arthur kept the rifle loaded now, always within reach. He taught Abigail how to use the old shotgun, her hands steady, her eyes clear as she learned to sight down the barrel. He hoped she would never have to use it. The day of the deadline arrived bright and clear, the sky a deceptive, peaceful blue. Mr. Hale was due that afternoon. They had done all they could. The ranch was productive, the larder was full, and they had a small amount of cash from selling vegetables and eggs in a neighboring town where their father's poison had not reached. It was not enough to clear the debt, but Arthur hoped it would be enough to prove their solvency, to earn an extension. He was cleaning the harnesses in the barn, the rhythmic work soothing his frayed nerves when he heard it. Not the sound of Mr. Hale's neat buggy, but the drunken shouts of men and the heavy, lumbering tread of several horses. He straightened up, his heart turning to ice. He looked toward the house, where Clara and Hannah were playing near the porch. Clara, Hannah, inside. Abigail's voice rang out, sharp with command. The little girls scrambled into the house as the other sisters appeared at the windows. Arthur grabbed the rifle from its resting place inside the barn door and walked out into the sunlight. 3 riders were coming up the lane. The man in the middle was large and florid-faced, his movements sloppy in the saddle. Patrick Donovan. On either side of him were 2 rough-looking men Arthur didn't recognize, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "Vance," Donovan roared, his voice thick with whiskey. "I've come for what's mine. Send my girls out." Arthur stopped in the middle of the yard, halfway between the barn and the house, planting his feet firmly in the dirt. He held the rifle loosely, pointed at the ground. "They're not yours to take, Donovan. They're free women. They've made their choice." "Choice," Donovan spat, pulling his horse to a halt. "They're my property, to work and to marry off as I see fit, and you're the thief who stole them." He swayed in the saddle. "I'll have them back, and I'll have my justice from your hide." The front door of the house opened. Abigail stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun held steady in her hands. She was followed by Eleanor, Cora, and Rose, who held axes and heavy farm implements. They stood there, a small, defiant army. "We are not your property, Father," Abigail said, her voice shaking but loud enough to carry across the yard. "We are not going back to your beatings and your rage. This is our home now." Donovan's face purpled with fury. "You ungrateful whelp, I'll teach you respect." He started to dismount, fumbling as he did so. The 2 men with him exchanged uneasy glances, but began to swing down from their horses as well. It was at that precise moment that 2 more vehicles appeared on the road. The first was Mr. Hale's familiar black buggy. The second was Sheriff McBride's, kicking up dust as he urged his horse forward. They arrived to a tableau of imminent violence. Arthur standing alone in the yard with a rifle, 3 armed men advancing on him, and 4 young women standing guard on a porch with farm tools and a shotgun. Sheriff McBride took in the scene in an instant. "Donovan, hold it right there," he yelled, pulling his own pistol. Donovan, blinded by rage and drink, ignored him. "This is a family matter," he bellowed, lunging toward Arthur. Arthur didn't raise his rifle to shoot. Instead, he moved with a speed that belied his years of lethargy. He stepped forward, using the rifle's stock to block Donovan's clumsy charge, sending the larger man stumbling sideways into the dirt. In the same motion, he brought the barrel up, not pointing it at Donovan, but at the two hired men who had frozen in place. "This is my land," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm, "and these are my people. The next man who takes a step forward will be carried off it." Mr. Hale watched, his mouth agape, from the safety of his buggy. He was not seeing a broken-down widower who had lost his grip. He was seeing a man defending his home and family with a cold, clear resolve. He was seeing the neat, productive fields, the solid fences, the well-kept barn. He was seeing the 7 sisters who were not cowering but standing their ground, ready to fight for the man who had given them sanctuary. Sheriff McBride dismounted, his gun still trained on Donovan's men. "He's right," the sheriff said. "This is his land. You're trespassing, and you're drunk. Get on your horses and ride out of my county before I lock you up for a month." The two men, seeing the sheriff's resolve and Arthur's steady gaze, needed no further convincing. They hauled a sputtering Patrick Donovan to his feet, threw him onto his horse, and galloped away without a backward glance. Silence descended on the yard, broken only by the sound of the wind and the heavy breathing of those left behind. Arthur slowly lowered the rifle. Abigail brought the shotgun down, her knuckles white. Mr. Hale finally climbed down from his buggy, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly around the yard, his eyes taking in every detail. He looked at the filled pantry shelves, visible through the open door. He looked at the healthy livestock. He looked at Arthur, then at Abigail and her sisters. "Vance," he said, his tone stripped of its usual condescension, "you have a remarkable workforce." "I have a family, Mr. Hale," Arthur corrected him quietly. Hale was silent for a long moment. He looked at the paperwork in his hand, the foreclosure notice he had come to serve. He seemed to weigh it against the reality of what he was seeing. "The board is looking for signs of stability," he said finally, as if thinking aloud. "Of productivity. It seems you've provided it." He folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat pocket. "I believe I can persuade them to grant you a 1-year extension, with a revised payment schedule." A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over Arthur. He leaned the rifle against the porch railing, feeling the tension drain out of him. Abigail let out a shuddering breath, and her sisters rushed to her side, their faces streaked with tears of relief. The ranch was safe. They were safe. In the middle of the yard, under the vast Montana sky, Arthur Vance looked at the 7 women who had crashed into his life and pulled him back from the brink. They had offered to be his hands, but they had become his heart. In the months that followed the confrontation, a new kind of peace settled over the Vance ranch, a peace that was earned and cherished. It was not the silent, empty peace of before, but one filled with the rhythms of a shared life. The fear of their father faded, replaced by the security of home. The judgment of the town softened into a grudging respect as word of the standoff, and the remarkable transformation of the ranch spread. Arthur was no longer a ghost in his own house. The grief for Martha remained, a quiet corner of his heart that would always be hers, but it was no longer an all-consuming darkness. It was a memory he could now hold without being shattered by it. He found himself smiling sometimes, a real smile that reached his eyes, usually at something Clara said, or at the sight of the sisters working together, their combined strength a force of nature. He and Abigail developed a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect that was as solid as the mountains surrounding them. They ran the ranch together, their decisions made over the long kitchen table, their easy collaboration, a silent language understood between them. The unspoken affection that grew there was as steady and natural as the changing seasons. The ranch flourished. It became a place of life and hope, a sanctuary not just for the Donovan sisters, but for the man who had lost his way in the wilderness of sorrow. He had been a widowed rancher on the verge of losing everything. He had been ready to let the world crumble. Until 7 beautiful, desperate sisters, fleeing a darkness he could barely imagine, had arrived on his doorstep. They offered to be his hands, to work his land. But in the end, they had done so much more. They had replanted his soul, mended his heart, and rebuilt his world, proving that a home is not just land and lumber, but the family you fight for, and that sometimes the most unexpected arrivals are the ones who save you.